So all of our speakers today are doing cutting edge work to better identify, understand, and combat human trafficking. And I hope this session today will bring attention to and catalyze new kinds of discussions on this issue and problem of human trafficking.
Here we are. Okay. Really quickly, I'll just go into a little bit about myself and my organization. As Kathleen said, I'm Sherrie Caltagirone. I'm the founder and executive director at Global Emancipation Network, which is a nonprofit that's dedicated to ending all forms of human trafficking all over the world. It's just a tiny mission set, right? Using a data and technology approach. And I want to preface this talk a little bit with that I am in Florida and we have Hurricane Nicole going overhead. So my internet keeps coming up and down. So if I do lose you, I will be back as soon as I can. As I mentioned, Global Emancipation Network is a nonprofit that's based in the US. And we lead with a technology and data focus. So some of the projects, the sorts of things that we get ourselves involved in always are really, they come from primary stakeholders. And when I say that, I mean law enforcement, government, victim service organizations, other nonprofits, and academia. So usually the way that takes place is that someone approaches us with a problem or we see a need, and then either our team ends up helping to build solutions, put together data sets for others. Sometimes it's just connecting them with others who we know could do that more effectively than we could. And we often involve third-party, particularly private sector tech businesses, and lean on their loaned resources, either in-kind support or loaned engineers to help us craft solutions. Some of the sorts of projects that we do are focused around business risk classification, so being able to identify when trafficking might be taking place within a business or platform. Victim identification, whether that's sex trafficking advertisements, identifying children in child sexual abuse material, modeling research, such as like using satellite feeds to identify labor trafficking sites, image analysis, natural language processing, optical character recognition, bits like that. And we really care a lot about the network portion of our name. So we engage in a lot of collaborative projects, such as like the Responsible AI out of Unicre, Angela Ruskin University, which is a policing institute out of the UK. And they have a children's safety and trafficking working group that we're a member of. The Traffic Analysis Hub is a major international project, which I think I'll share a little bit more about later. The California Polytechnic State University, Cal Poly, has a California Cybersecurity Institute, and part of that is a Trafficking Investigations Hub, of which we're the founding members. And then we also just recently launched a podcast. So stay tuned for a little bit more on that. So let me dive here into these slides. One of the things that we all know is a problem in this space, and I know that I don't need to get into sort of the issues here about, setting the scene, what trafficking looks like. But actually, Jean-Pierre, you mentioned one of the things that I was talking about here is that we really face an uphill battle, and that we have shortages in lots of issues. And we are a step behind in where our goals are in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and ending human trafficking around the world. Some of these issues that we have or shortages that we have include a shared understanding. Different organizations or countries and governments define trafficking differently. I got into a great conversation with someone at NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, when we were even, both of us have been in this field around 20 years, and we both said, what do you mean when you say child abuse and exploitation? What does that include? What doesn't it include? So when there are those of us who've been in it for quite a while, don't always agree or have to define terms, that this is a major ripple effect that creates differences in even like prevalence estimates that we have. Some of the other issues that we have are reliable, repeatable methodology for programming, for prevalence estimates, so many issues around that. And related to that, data measurability. Once we have crafted a program, how do we measure its effectiveness? How do we know where to focus our resources if we can't figure out how big a problem set is, for example? We also face shortages in cross-sector collaboration. There have been many times, and I'm sure everyone here has been in the same situation when there have been discussions when you feel like primary stakeholders are missing from the table, let alone trying to draw in deliberately cross-disciplinary teams, whether that's in research projects or in anything operational. It continues to be an issue that just compounds all the other shortages. Of course, staffing, in-kind support, monetary giving, these are all sort of givens, particularly within the nonprofit space, but I think it's for everyone really. Investigative power, whether those are data and technology bits, screening tools, just equipping frontline stakeholders again with the ability to understand a given issue or to investigate issues. Victim services, I think that's another one that we are all very, very familiar with, that our goal is, of course, to work ourselves out of a job, all of us in this field, I think. And we are doing that by extracting victims or more importantly, empowering them to change their own situations. How do we make sure that we are providing that foundation of support underneath them? And then part of these, and these are a little bit more challenging in many ways, making sure that you have government support and political will. And I think that we are seeing these play out actually right now within the UK. They've been looking at their referral mechanisms right now. There was a recent report that came out, and you're seeing some of these government support and political will questions come about. So all of this is to share sort of the field of where we're at in combating trafficking, or what some of the issues that we are currently facing. And then I want to keep this in the back of our minds as we're looking at the next couple of slides here. In order to combat trafficking at a bigger scale and to more effectively allocate the resources that we have, we need to be paying attention to a couple of things. One of them is, this is a system that's called Wardlike Mapping, and I've only recently learned about this, but I really like this analytic framework for it, and it applies in so many ways. The slide that you'll see here, the image here, is a little bit more technical, and please keep in mind that we're a tech-based nonprofit, so that's sort of where my bias lays anyway. But the idea, I think, carries out throughout, and it's really trying to look at a problem set or an opportunity area and think about where should you build, where should you buy, and what should you outsource. And you'll see on the left sort of this value chain when things are really visible to you with high value, things that are not super visible. Doesn't necessarily mean low value, but perhaps lower. And then down at the bottom on the x-axis here, you have a little bit more around sort of these new divergent areas and fields of exploration. Things that are productized, things that you can go out and get off the shelf tools for, or looking at a non-tech focus, then that's programs that are already well established that we know that are working in some ways. And then sort of those base things that we know that we all need in order to do this work. And the one at the bottom here is perfect because it's power. And there's another good example out there of how jet fuel is really important because it fuels rockets, which can, launch satellites, which is reliant on for cell signals and whatnot, right? So these are the real foundational bits. No one in trafficking, of course, should be, worrying about making sure that you have electricity or, caring about the price of jet fuel. And yet those are the issues that underpin so much of what we're doing. So I would encourage everyone here to think about this. And the reason why I've put this box around the circle here in blue is that this is the area that we are most likely to have the biggest impact and the problems that we should all be focusing on. Not necessarily this image manipulation, the photo storage bit, but where the greatest need is right now, where there isn't a solution set and where we can have the greatest impact in developing new things. That doesn't mean that you should come up with green skies or blue skies thinking and just run with something completely wild though. The next bit that I wanted to show you here is that in order to sort of understand the field and combat the issues of duplication and fragmentation within human trafficking is that you first need to understand that landscape a little bit more. And I wanted to point out two resources actually that we have that are really critical. I was at the Tech Against Trafficking Summit in Seattle at the end of September. And it was really fantastic because there were, everyone in the room cared about using technology and data to combat trafficking. And it had most of the primary stakeholders as far as organizations come from government. The State Department was there, OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, Polaris, sort of all the main players, right? And we were all heads down thinking about how to use technology and scale our efforts. But one of the things that came up out of it was that there were a few different product demonstrations, like 15-minute lightning talks out of it. And we saw 3 or 4 tools which had very similar, technology stacks for the same problem area, particularly looking at supply chain management or looking at victims in farm labor, agriculture. And so it sort of brought home, and I think that they did this deliberately, placing things that were quite similar back to back on it, but it just pointed out that fragmentation even more. So there have been a couple of organizations like Tech Against Trafficking, like OSCE, who have been trying to map the space, not just the tech against trafficking sort of side, the technology and data angle, but really helping us all understand what thousands of stakeholders are that we should be collaborating with. And then trying to do things like organize them and sort of create an analytic framework for understanding the resources. And this is obviously completely fundamental work. The point being, if something already exists and you think that you could do it better, try to work within that organization to improve it or throw more resourcing behind it so that you can scale it. Or if you have something that really is a novel idea that would meet a need and has a user base for it, then everybody should be supporting that effort. So the 2 that I would point to for everyone to use whenever you're coming up with sort of a new idea or that you've identified a need in the space for your problem mission set, to use these sorts of tools. And I would encourage also anyone who doesn't have a technology base for what they're doing, that they should be mapping it along this methodology as well. The next one I'll point out, and I'm trying to keep us a little bit on track. I know that we're set to end in the next 10 minutes or so. So I'm going a little bit quickly through that, but please do reach out if you wanted a little bit more information on these. But we created the human trafficking kill chain a number of years ago. And this is an idea that's built off of a cyber kill chain framework from Lockheed Martin. And then even more, that it's a military idea. And it's about understanding and tracking adversary process. The bits that you see at the top, detect, deny, disrupt, degrade, deceive, destroy, these are your sort of response continuum, the things that you have at your disposal as someone working in the counter-trafficking field. And then the phases that you see, and I want to emphasize that you don't see all of these phases in every sort of trafficking event that you'd have, but most of the time, most of these elements will be present. Recruitment, transportation, entrapment, brokering, delivery, and exploitation. And you'll see when you sort of break all of these down, and I'll take, for example, the top one around recruitment here and just explain that a little bit more. The most important thing, of course, is that you're able to detect it. You're able to see what it looks like and have insight into it, which is one of those shortages that we tend to have in this field, isn't it? It's just basic insight into what's happening on the ground. So things like you can just collect prostitution advertisements that you suspect has trafficking in it. You can, under disruption, you can shut down these sorts of advertisement sites like we saw on Backpage or you've seen in other sites. You could place several false ads that are really sting operations that can make discovery difficult, for example. And the idea is that some of these have a greater length and strength of impact here. So really coming through, combining the, say, Wardlike mapping for where your ideas should lay, and then placing it sort of on this analytic framework. And I don't want to seem like this is the only one, but these are the sort of strategy things that we need to be thinking about in order to disrupt or to heal really the fragmentation and collaboration in the industry. Let me just go on to the next page here so that we can keep moving. Some of the lessons that I want us to move going forward. I was at another conference recently that hosted a survivor. Her name was Kendall, and she had this really remarkable program that she was discussing there, and it was called the Red Chair. And she's an artist. And I've really liked the physical reminder that this is just a folding chair that you probably see at, Costco sort of thing, but it was bright red. And the idea was that in every conversation, in every space, you should remember that it involves actual people and actual victims. So if it's about us being trafficking victims or survivors, not without us, meaning that any program that we should have should always start with involving those with lived experience. This is absolutely critical. It's just sort of basic, almost like user research, if you can think of it that way, that it's very important that we bounce ideas off, that we are providing full-time positions for survivors so that they can bubble up sort of the knowledge that they have gained and from their networking with other survivors, because of course we all know that one lived experience is different from every other one. And we need to make sure that they're always at the table as we're considering implementing or measuring any sort of program. I've focused quite a bit in this short presentation here about just resource mapping, understanding the foundation of any program, understanding the space really well and who the various actors are in it. The key lesson being know what already exists, don't duplicate. There is such a shortage of resources and people and in money and time that we can't just keep recreating the wheel all the time. The best piece of advice I got when I started Global Emancipation Network in 2016 was don't start a nonprofit. And at the time I sort of laughed it off, and now I realize that they weren't really telling me don't do this. The lesson was always try to find out if there's anyone else who's doing it, who would allow you to start a new program within their nonprofit so that you can reduce the duplication and further sort of exacerbate the scarcity of resources that are already present and rife in this area. The next one is really those two analytic frameworks that I mentioned to you, considering which options for your programming, for your research projects, for selecting a tool, whatever it is, can have the most impact and scalability. How can you have the greatest impact with the smallest amount of resources that can hopefully be used across several different stakeholder groups? And in order to know, of course, which ones would have the greatest impact and are the most scalable, you need to have robust measurement models. And this is a place where I would really encourage the academic community to be focusing efforts as well. We currently don't have very great methods for understanding when a program is effective, particularly as there's different programs of various sizes. And this also applies as well to understanding prevalence estimates and goes back to the issues of fragmentation within the community. The next one is also very important in this space. I mentioned that we take the network portion of our name very seriously, but that can sometimes feel really uncomfortable, and it's something that we have to lean into. We must engage in radical collaboration. And for instance, one example that I would provide to you is that we at Global Emancipation Network have been helping with content moderation efforts among some of the adult services websites. And we have had almost like a crisis of conscience in it, in that, of course, our sympathies lie with victims in this space, particularly, or people who are being exploited or feel like these are sort of the only areas that they can sort of meet their living needs in it. But at the same time, if we can get over that discomfort and we can prevent one person from being victimized or empower another one from coming out of a vulnerable situation, it is well worth doing. It's really important that when we are in yet another meeting about audit requirements or whatever it is that sort of makes all of us grown in this space, that we remember that that sort of collaboration is crucial and contributes to better programs, and that ultimately meet our goals of working ourselves out and this mission space. The next bit that I would mention is that all of us, and I love speaking with communities like this one, is that we all tend to understand the value of research in this space, and that even those who are a little bit more operationally minded here, people who are on the ground working with victims or who are actually doing operations, they tend not to participate in research, and which is really a shame, because they have sort of the ground truth in any program area. And just as important, those of us who are more academically minded or who do participate in research, we're not always good with crossing that divide, sharing the findings between the academic world and making sure that either people who are operational know about the work that we've done, or that the work translates very well. So again, this is sort of preaching to the choir with this particular group, I know, but I would suggest that everyone lean into the latter side of making sure that we are that everything is actually operational, what our ideas are, that we can pass up the baton for the next organization or next person to continue that work. The last lesson that I would point out going forward is how important it is to track legislation and policy internationally, and knowing what is coming down the pipeline. It seems like, particularly Jean-Pierre, with your work at the British Institute and your legal mind, I know that you would agree with what I'm saying here, but it's really important for you to understand the conversations that are happening in other parts of the world, know about the bills that could impact your work or adjacent fields. We're all discussing sort of the Earn It Act or the online harms bills right now that are happening in the world. But of course, if you're doing the sort of resource mapping that I'm encouraging you to do, and you're focused, you've identified that there's a need to do one sort of program, but then you are completely unaware that in probably a year's time, you would have to change that model because of new legislation, you were contributing accidentally to fragmentation and wasted resources here. So the way that you can also make sure that you're preventing from that sort of effect is to have the conversations, insert yourself into various rooms, keep yourself informed on what's happening on policy fronts. So I think, Kathleen, we've got ourselves back on schedule here, but please, I'm leaving this up here. This is our Twitter handle. This is my email address, and I encourage you to reach out with questions.